Hello. Today we are doing array2 shift left. So we want to return an array that is left shifted by 1. So in this case, we have 6, 2, 5, 3, and all the elements will be shifted to the left. But of course, since nothing is to the left of 6, in other words, there isn't a position for 6 to assume as we shift the entire array to the left, it becomes rather difficult. And so in this case, um, if it doesn't have a space, or if it doesn't have a position to occupy, it essentially gets sent to the back. So we are in fact shifting everything to the left, with the exception that if a given element doesn't have a position to shift to, then it assumes the position, the last position, respectively, whatever that may be, whatever element that may be, rather. So there are really two ways to do this. You can either return a new array, or you could modify the existing array. For the first one, we're actually going to be returning a new array, and then we'll discuss how to actually modify the existing array. So if you think about it, we have an array, and the array is essentially called nums. And let me actually make this. So the array is called, let's see, the array is called nums. And nums, if we were to assume, let's assume a particular case where we have, where we actually only have 4 elements. So that would be, of course, 4 boxes here. And we don't want to forget that each box, each element, it has an index which helps the for loop actually reference the elements that we may have. Or in several contexts, is this is referencing the index to actually get to the element inside the box is actually the way we actually assess what the element is, or we can mutate the array. That is, of course, to change the value. So we have the nums array, length 4. So the length is 4, but of course the total number of indexes is 3, because the count actually starts from 0. Then of course we have another array. This time this array is actually going to be the new array that we want to return. So this is called new array. And I'm going to change this to another color, let's say green. And suppose that in the nums array we had, let's see, so let's say we had 4, 8, 3, and 2. What we'd want to do is we'd want to shift everything to the left, with the exception that if there's no space to the right, or to the left rather, we'll just send that element to the back. So realistically speaking, we would want this element, we would actually want to return, in this case, it seems like we would want to return 8, 3, 2, and 4. So you can clearly see that this element becomes the first, and it follows this pattern, and this element actually gets sent to the back. So when we actually create a new array, by default, the values that we have in the array are all 0. So it's just creating, so when I create a new array, it's going to have its default values of 0. And of course, the new array length, that is, of course, the length of how many elements we have in new array, will be the same amount of elements that we have in the nums array. Just because we're either modifying or returning a new array, which sort of shifts all the elements to the left, doesn't mean that we have any less elements than what we had before in the nums array, the original array. We're just rearranging the numbers, not by any means are we sort of reducing the numbers that are in the array. So what's my strategy? Well, my strategy is to populate the new array with only these elements. So we're going to have a for loop, which is going to start from this place and then populate everything for the rest of the array. So that way, 8, 3, and 2 will essentially be in these boxes. So we're going to have a for loop. And let me go ahead and actually start writing the code here. So if you think about it, we would want to have an integer called new array, and the length of which will essentially mimic the nums array. So it would be nums.length, which resolves to how many elements we have, how many boxes within which elements are contained. Then, of course, we want a for loop, and a standard for loop would look something like this, which actually traverses the nums array. We want to be able to look at each and every element so that we can assess what to move to the right, or actually what to do in general. So my strategy was to actually start from this point and populate the new array with all the elements starting at the first index to the end of the array, excluding the first element. And so the way that I would do that is, instead of having my for loop start from 0, traversing from 0, I would instead begin my for loop traversing from the first index, so that we're actually starting our searching the array from here. And then, of course, while searching, we would populate the new array. So instead of starting it from 0, I'm actually going to start it from 1, and it would increment for the rest of the array. And while I do this, I'm going to have new array of 0 will equal nums of I. So new array, the first element in new array will be equal to nums of I, which is of course 8, on the first iteration, because I is equal to 1. So I references the element which is at the first index, which is 8, and then it stores it in the first element, it stores it in the box which is responsible for storing the first element referenced by the 0th index. But of course, we want to repeat this process again and again for each and every single element. And because as we do this for loop, it's just going to keep updating what is in the first box for the new array, which is referenced by the 0th index. We want it to constantly increment as far as new array is concerned, so that we can keep populating as we iterate through. So in order to do that, we're actually going to not have 0 here. We're going to have a variable called index, which is going to be a variable, an integer value. And index is sort of going to keep track of which index we're on for the new array. And then each time we populate one box, we'll increment index by 1 so that we move on to the next element, and then populate that default value of 0 to so the variable that is keeping track of the index for nums is I, and the variable keeping track of the index for new array is index. And they're both incrementing each and every time the for loop executes. So they increment alongside each other and populate what is in the nums array inside the new array. As we do this, so let me go ahead and this is of course not the end of the code, but let's at least show you what we have up until this point. So int nums is equal to, let's say, 4, 3, 5, and 8. And now we can create a new array called new array and equate that to int or new int, and the length of which will be nums.length. Since the length is the same, we're not by any means changing the length. And then we will use a for loop, which in a standard sense looks like this. And we're not going to start at 0. We're instead going to start at 1 so that we can do what we mentioned before. And as we do this, we are going to populate the nums array with so I think this achieves our purpose. And what you'll notice now, just to assess where we are, we'll actually print we'll print the elements in the new array to see what we have. And let me just do it kind of like this here. Print line and like this. So it seems like this isn't working too well because we actually need to update the value for index so that we move from populating just the first element, because index is 0, so this resolves to new array of 0. And each time the for loop executes, it keeps updating the value for 0. So we actually have to increment index by 1. And then we get 3580. So we get 358. So those elements move to the left of the array completely. But of course, 4 is not at the end of the array as we would want. So how do we actually do this? Well, since we've successfully moved all the elements in the array to the left except the 4, at the end, we recognize that no matter how many elements of the array that we have, excluding 0 and 1, this element will always be moved. The first element in the array will always be moved to the last. So we've successfully transferred all the elements to the left, and you'll see here that we have a 0 here, but we want a 4 at the end. So what we will do is we will essentially keep track, or rather store the first element in the array into a int variable called first, and then populate new array after it is done populating the rest of the elements. We'll populate the new array with, we'll populate the first element in the new array with, or sorry, the last element with the first element in the nums array. So that would look something like this. Before the code gets a chance to execute, let's say int first equals nums of 0. And after this is all said and done, we will simply say new array at nums.length, which is the last element in the array, will essentially equal the first element. And then we successfully would have moved all the elements to the left and also transferred the first to the very right. taking this code into CodingBat, we can see that if we return the new array, then we're getting all greens except we're moving out of bounds. Moving out of bounds because we increment the index by 1, but of course we're not taking into account whether or not we are at the edge of the array. Or actually, sorry, no, that's not the case. We're getting out of bounds because we're incrementing the index by 1, but what if there are no elements? So we're going to preface this by saying, if at all the nums.length is less than or equal to 1, then we'll just return that array. And then we get all greens. So this is just one way to do it. Let me share another way, which is of course modifying the array that we have. So suppose we had 4 elements, all of which have their own index. So what would we do in this case if we were to modify the array instead of actually returning, let's say we had 4, 8, 3, 5. Hopefully that resembles what we had last time. And in this case, we would do something that looks like this. So we would have a for loop int I is equal to 0, I is less than nums.length, increment I by 1. So nums of I will be equal to nums of I plus 1. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Well, I'll show you. As we're essentially, suppose we're on this element here in the array, then, or actually let's, okay, so this is the nums array, right? Oops. This is the nums array. And let's just sort of imagine that let's sort of imagine that we have a new array here, which is called, obviously it's going to be called new array. And of course the values inside here are all zeros. And essentially, if we have this code for the first iteration when we're on 0, nums of I will be equal to nums of I plus 1. So nums of I is, it's saying, okay, this is the nums array, and this is the new array. And nums of I, which is 0, will be equal to nums of I plus 1. So nums of I, we're at nums sub 0, which is 4. And this element will be equal to nums of I plus 1, which is the next element. So here we have 8. As we increment again, I becomes not 0, but instead it becomes 1 because we increment I by 1. Then it says nums of I will be equal to nums of I plus 1. So nums of I is 1. And then what is inside here will be equal to what is here. Hence, this becomes 3. Similarly, this becomes 5. Right? And you'll notice here again that we've moved all the elements respectively to all these places, but we've sort of not taken into account that the first element would sort of disappear. So we would keep track of the first element just like this. And after it's all said and done, we'll actually do what we did before, which was take this array. So this array, after this process is sort of done here, we would essentially have something that looks like this. We would have 8, 3, 5, and then we would have 0 here. And we would want to take this and set it equal to this. So we would actually just be saying that, okay, nums of nums.length minus 1, which is the last element in the array, will be equal to first, and first will just be this element. Or sorry, this element which disappeared. So let's go back here and try this new approach. So int for int new array is going to be equal to new int, and that length will resemble the length of the nums array. We're also going to keep track of the first element in the array, and we are going to iterate through the length of the array. As we do this, we're going to update the value of the current element to what is to the right of it. Since we are incrementing by 1, we want to take into account that we could walk off the edge of the array. After this process is done, we can then, of course, judge what we have for the array and then move forward from there. So we have all zeros. Right. We're not actually going to be returning a new array. We're just modifying the array that we have. So kind of ignore the reference that I made to the new array. Just consider that to be the same, sort of the same array that we had before. So what's happening here? It moves 3 and then 5 and then 8, but it sort of makes this 4 disappear. And so that's when we actually want to say, okay, well, nums of nums.length minus 1, which is the last element in the array, will essentially be equal to first. And that should take care of it. 3, 5, 8, 4, which is what we wanted to return. So let's go ahead and move back to CodingBat here. This works as well. Recall that we actually didn't omit this part of the code, which actually takes into account that the length of the array may be less than or equal to 1, in which case we just want to return nums. We can't really move anything to the right, or rather to the left.